This video is sponsored by the Magnet Baron. More about them later on. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and we are on the threshold of the official full release of Warhammer 40k 10th edition. And with that in mind, we got today the new Forge World datasheets for use with the 10th edition of the game. So let's dive into them, talk about some of the craziest that we got amongst this clutch of indexes. As always, if you enjoy my Warhammer 40k content, go ahead and drop a like on the video, subscribe on the channel, do all that YouTube stuff. And before we dive into it, let's talk for a moment about our sponsor today, the Magnet Baron. Are you gearing up for Warhammer 40k's 10th edition, but unsure of what war gear you want your units to be equipped with? With a new rule set for the game comes a ton of new challenges, and it's hard to be prepared for everything. You've got new opposing armies to play against, new enemy units to contend with, and a quickly changing metagame. Maybe you're worried about erratas impacting your models or the loadouts you've assembled them with. Well, I have an easy solution for you, and that is magnets. And the easiest way to access that easy solution is the Magnet Baron, your one-stop shop for all of your model modularity needs. Nailed it. The Magnet Baron is the best place to go to get your armies ready for playing within the new edition. They offer magnetization sets for a wide variety of Warhammer 40k model kits that includes the specific components that you need to magnetize them and allow them to build in any loadout available. So your units can remain flexible without having to break the bank buying additional bits or extra models. Not only that, but the Magnet Baron also includes a wide variety of other useful gaming accessories, including sturdy flight stands that don't snap as soon as you take them out of the box, convenient movement trays for moving large units around, as well as a wide variety of hobby magnets in a frankly ridiculous selection of shapes and sizes. So you can modulate any bit for any model and any part of your collection. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com to get your army ready for the new edition of Warhammer 40k and remain flexible as the game develops. So all of these Forge World indexes contain completely legal, competitively playable datasheets for use with Warhammer 40k. And we saw some stealth updates to the points values of the game in the Munitorum field manual on the Warhammer community download section. They actually added the points values for these a couple days ago, so we knew what was being included and what to expect from their points costs long before we actually saw the datasheet. And some people were actually able to data mine some information from the Games Workshop app, but now we have full data sheets. So here we go, diving in with our first one, the Tau Tetra. Now these cute little speeders are unironically one of my favorite models in the Tau range. I just think they're so cute. They're like little go-karts for Tau fire warriors. It also helps that they are entirely selfless, not really wasting any space in their datasheet for themselves, but only buffing the rest of your army. 14 inches of movement, and while their defensive characteristics are mediocre with a 4+ save, toughness 7, and 7 wounds, at 40 points per model, 80 points for a unit of 2 of them, they aren't the easiest thing to take down, especially since for their intended purpose, you only need one of them to have line of sight to the enemy. They're equipped with a pair of pulse rifles, so they can shoot 4 strength 5 attacks if they really want to, but most of the time they're gonna be eschewing a lot of their shooting in order to sit back and act as observers. That's because the most important ability on their datasheet is high intensity marker lights. This grants full hit rerolls to their guided unit while attacking their chosen spotted unit. For those who don't know, this interfaces with the core Tau mechanic. This allows units during the shooting phase to choose before they go to shoot to act as a guiding unit. This grants +1 to hit, and if they have a marker light, like the Tetras do, ignore cover to another unit. Both units have to have visibility to the unit guided against, so the observer picks a unit within its own line of sight, points that out to the guided unit, and the guided unit gets the benefits. This is basically the entire purpose of the Tetra. It's a fast, light vehicle that's able to use its infiltrator ability and rapid movement to get line of sight to cheeky enemy units, observe them for other friendly units, and if your friendly unit has line of sight to that, they're going to not only get +1 to hit and the bonus from marker lights for ignore cover, they are also going to get that full hit reroll from the Tetra's ability. And as we'll talk about later in this video, they do have some big units that are going to benefit greatly from those hit rerolls. And this is why the resilience of the Tetra is actually pretty good for what it does. For a unit of 2 of them, you just poke the toe edge of one of them outside of whatever ruin they're hiding behind, draw a line of sight to observe the target enemy, and if they fire back, it's unlikely they will one-shot the Tetra unit unless they commit a very expensive and hard-hitting unit themselves, in which case you're probably fine with just losing one unit of Tetras to whatever they're shooting at it. Otherwise, if they only kill a single Tetra, you just pull the one in line of sight and use the 14-inch movement on the other one next turn to run back in and continue to act as an observer unit. The Infiltrator's ability is also great. It lets them do more utility things like use their relatively large bulk to screen out large areas of the battlefield from enemy turn 1 deep strikers, and ultimately, Tetras just seem like an incredibly useful unit. Now, while they aren't in the Tau Codex and don't get the benefit of the spotter and observed mechanics, another unit that would love to be observed for is our next one, the Medusa Carriage Battery. All the way through their final 9th edition Codex, Carriage batteries have been an integral part of the Astra Militarum game plan, and it doesn't look like that's changing anytime soon. In their 10th edition index, artillery is really the name of the game for Astra Militarum. They have a bunch of ways to interact with artillery, and it looks like their whole game plan is going to be about controlling the middle of the table so that they can slowly pound their opponent to death using units like basilisks, wyverns, and manticores. And adding into that arsenal of offensive firepower is the Medusa Carriage Battery. This thing just fills into the soup of different artillery units. The new Carriage Battery mechanics count them as infantry, and they do have the regiment keyword, meaning that they can be affected by infantry orders from nearby officers. And while orders don't splash so much anymore, so the one model unit Medusa Carriage Battery is not a particularly efficient order target, their offensive profile is incredibly good compared with other artillery. They fire D6 shots, and while their ballistic skill is only 5+, they do have the heavy weapon ability, so they can get +1 to hit for remaining stationary, +1 ballistic skill for being ordered to take aim, and if you have line of sight from the Medusa itself, or you target an enemy with a Scout Sentinel, you can actually ignore the penalty for hitting for indirect fire. So you can get these things down to hitting on 3s, but if you don't have orders around, they're most likely hitting on 4s. And with that, they are Strength 10, AP 3 for a flat 3 damage. It's a really good gun. It's a good gun to have. In addition to that, they automatically force battle shock checks on whatever they shoot at, which is occasionally useful, especially if you're trying to steal objectives away from them or prevent them from interrupting in combat. Although, as we've talked about on the channel in the past, mid-round battle shock checks that happen before your opponent's command phase aren't actually that useful since they don't really disrupt scoring, but it's nice to have. And I think alongside a lot of the other Imperial Guard artillery, these things are going to be a pretty common appearance. Manticores are only, I think, 105 points, so 3 of those and 3 of these guys comes in at less than 500, which is an absolute steal for the amount of indirect fire that you're getting out of it. Pretty short and sweet. These things are really good at shooting at people. Against enemy indirect fire, they're even a little bit resilient given that they are toughness 7 with 6 wounds, so they don't exactly fall apart if targeted by Desolators. You have to work pretty hard to kill them, and for their 65 point per model cost, they're efficient enough that your opponent will not feel great about that trade. So all in all, just a super good gun. And you know what buffs super good guns is another favorite of the channel that is returning to the Astra Militarum stable, the Trojan support vehicle. For 80 points, this guy gets you a pretty standard Chimera-esque chassis, a T9 with 11 wounds and a 3+ save. It's not much to write home about and doesn't mount many guns, just a hull-mounted heavy bolter and a hunter-killer missile. But what you're really bringing this guy for is to support your larger vehicles, because they bring their support vehicle ability. This allows you in your command phase to select a friendly Astra Militarum vehicle within 3 inches, heal it for D3 wounds, and allow it to reroll hit rolls of 1. I'm really glad that this doesn't give you +1 to hit, because it wouldn't then interact with other weapon abilities like heavy. This allows you to not only order a vehicle to take aim with Lord Solar Leontis or a squadron commander, but then if you also have the heavy keyword, you can get an additional +1 to hit. So you can get a lot of Astra Militarum vehicles to hitting on 2s, and now with this Trojan support vehicle, rerolling their 1s, which makes them incredibly likely to convert those hit rolls. And for a faction that is basically entirely built around a 4+ ballistic skill, that level of efficiency is pretty exciting to get to. Not costed competitively enough to be able to spam and buff a lot of your line squadron tanks. This thing is a little bit less than half the cost of another Lehman Russ, so instead of giving a Lehman Russ reroll 1s, you'd probably just spend those points on additional offensive vehicles. But once you start talking about vehicles with lots of weapons, I think that the Trojan support vehicle is an absolute shoo-in. And given how tank-oriented the metagame is right now, cracking tanks open is absolutely absolutely imperative. So looking at profiles like the Shadow Sword, which is able to mount 4 las cannons and 5 twin heavy bolters on it, you suddenly get to the point that stacking 80 points on the back of that thing to give it reroll 1s is super worthwhile. And on top of that, heal it for some damage, which is always nice. The Shadow Sword has that heavy weapon attribute on its Volcano Cannon, so alongside the support of Lord Solar Leontis, it is able to get down to that vaunted 2+ ballistic skill we were just talking about, and you can have this thing hitting on 2s and rerolling at 1s with that enormous 12 damage devastating wounds gun. I think any of the super heavy Imperial Guard chassis are going to love to see this guy next to them, and while I don't think it's necessarily worthwhile to buff the more inexpensive tanks, I do think it is if you start to bring those big Baneblade. Now, the one downside of this is that it can't stack alongside the Regimental Engines here, so you can't give both reroll 1s to hit and a 4+ invulnerable save. Basically, you have to pick either your offensive buff or your defensive buff, and for the most part, it also means you can't heal them for 2 D3 mortal wounds, only D3, which is fair, but all told, I think that the Trojan support vehicle is definitely worth taking a look at if you're running those big super heavies. Now, moving back to the Xenos factions, we can talk about the Eldari and their aspect warriors, the Shadow Spectres. These guys come in toting a pretty standard aspect warrior top-line profile. They're T3 with an impressive 3+ save, 5+ invulnerable save, and a couple extra wounds on their Exarch. What's nutty about these is the amount of efficiency they get out of that profile, though. They bring a Prism Rifle that can either fire an 18-inch range blast, attack, or a single Strength 6 AP2 3-damage gunshot. While it's not much to write home about, the high damage is pretty good, and it's mostly good for skirmishing with enemy infantry. The benefit here is that these things are 16 points per model and come packaged with not only the deep strike ability, but also the stealth keyword. So even if you can get to grips with them, they are hard to shoot at. They're probably a 2+ save and cover with an invulnerable save and -1 to be hit, but that is assuming that you can even see them. They also have the Shade of Twilight ability, which allows you in your shooting phase after they've made their attacks to make a move up to 6 inches. With a base movement of 12, this lets this unit move a potential 18 inches a turn if they have a target to shoot at, or they can just use it to move out of cover, shoot at their opponent, do some damage, and then fly back. So they're both good playing offensively when stealing enemy objectives by moving super far across the map, or defensively when keeping themselves safe. With that Deep Strike ability and the lack of rules preventing models from moving after Deep Strike in 10th edition, you can even Deep Strike them in line of sight of a juicy target, shoot it to death, and then move back behind line of sight blocking terrain, allowing you to keep these things pretty safe for the entirety of the game. And all that for just 16 points a model. 80 points for a unit of 5 of these things seems like an absolute steal, and they seem incredibly useful in a wide variety of situations. While I don't think they're gonna table anybody's armies, their weapon profile is good, but not groundbreaking. Although with Eldar's ability to buff them, they can get some work out of it. They're most likely going to be putting that effort into shooting you with D-cannons and Wraith Guard and stuff like that. These guys skirmishing around the edges, acting as support models, are going to be super duper useful. Now, Eldar aren't exactly starved for good 5 to 10 model units that can fulfill these support roles, so whether or not Shadow Spectres see play alongside things like Warp Spiders, I don't know, but I do think that they are certainly worth a look. Now, with that, we'll move on to a particular class of unit that Forge World specializes in, and that is the big super heavy stuff, and mostly characterized now by the Towering keyword. Now, so far, the Towering keyword has been highly controversial. It essentially gives you the ability to ignore the obscuring effect that Ruin Terrain has. I talked about it in my video earlier this week discussing all of the terrain rolls in 40k, and you can see how incredibly powerful this keyword is in that video. If your opponent is hiding behind ruins that would normally prevent line of sight from being traced across them, the Towering keyword allows you to ignore that. And while enemies can also ignore it when targeting you, units with Towering tend to be incredibly difficult to kill, so that's not so much of a problem. So far, there have been a couple specific instances where this is problematic. Things that are high resilience and have maybe an overtuned damage output can push the Towering keyword to their limits. And it's been kind of constrained to just a couple specific types of units, but with Forge World units out now, we will see some units with the Towering keyword that have some absolutely ludicrous damage output. So let's talk about it and some reasons that it might be time to rejigger your terrain and ensure that it doesn't have too many holes in it. Otherwise, these things will be shooting you all the way across the table with no hiding. Now, the first one returns back to the Xenos factions and the Tau Empire for the Tonar Supremacy Armor. One of the benefits that the Tau faction ability, that guided and observed ability we discussed earlier, really helps with is focusing buffs onto these huge, enormous battleship-style units that mount a ton of guns. And the Tonar is basically the exemplar of that style of unit. The top-line profile of this thing is absolutely nuts. It is a T13 2+ save that can now benefit from cover, giving it effectively a 1+ save with a 5+ invulnerable save, behind 30 wounds. It can be damaged once it gets down to 10 wounds, but getting there is going to be a little bit tough. But thank goodness it can no longer save your protocols to any surrounding drones. At least there's that. The Tonar can mount a variety of carapace-mounted weapons, including pulse ordnance drivers that sweep infantry pretty efficiently, or Nexus missile launchers that are more of a mid-range profile, but I think the headliner and definitely the flashiest choice here is the heavy rail cannon array. This is a heavy weapon, allowing it to get +1 to hit if remaining stationary, so if it's using that towering keyword to get line of sight to your units, even if they're hiding behind ruins, then it's able to hit it on a 3+, stacking with the +1 ballistic skill from being guided, getting it down to a 2+ ballistic skill, and giving itself reroll once to hit, thanks to its coordinated strike ability. So this thing can be hitting on 2s, and at strength 26, mostly wound the entire game on 2s. Even up to opposing Townars, it will wound on 2s. Things like monoliths, it may go to 3s, but if you're guiding it with a unit like stealth battlesuits, you can actually give it reroll 1s to wound. So you can potentially, in the perfect situation, be hitting on 2s and wounding on 2s with all of the shots from this rail cannon array. It does only fire 2 attacks, but they are AP5, 16 damage, with devastating wounds. So if you accidentally roll a 6 to wound, you just plow your opponent for most of their health, if not kill them outright if they're targeting a smaller unit. Now, an interesting thing about the guided versus observed mechanic is that a lot of the buffs you can give are exclusive because they're based on the unit that's observing for the Tonar. So you can take your pick of benefits you want to give it. The Tetra we just talked about before can give it hit rerolls. It can ignore cover with marker lights. It can get hit rerolls from the Tetra, lethal hits from Unity Devastation, or those aforementioned reroll 1s to wound from a unit of stealth suits observing for it. So there's a lot of ways you can buff this huge rail cannon array, but those aren't the only weapons equipped to the Tonar Supremacy Armor. It also has 2 sets of arm-mounted weapons. These are either Triaxis Ion Cannons or Fusion Eradicators. The Triaxis Ion Cannon is a D6 plus 3 shot blast weapon, and in its overcharged profile comes in at Strength 9, AP 3 for 3 damage. Strength 9 is really where you want to start at to be an anti-tank weapon, so this thing, with its blast keyword, is both good at clearing infantry, but is also good at punching holes in armor. Alternative to that, you could also equip the Fusion Eradicator, a 5-shot, Strength 10, AP 4, D6 damage gun with Melta 3. This one only does fire 24 inches, so it's going to get that Melta 3 for D6 plus 3 damage if it gets within 12. Kind of unlikely for a Tau army, especially a relatively slow walker like the Tonar Supremacy Armor, but it is possible. Now, whichever one of these you choose, you can mix and match them or take 2 of the same, allowing you to fire up to 2d6 plus 6 ion cannon shots or 10 Fusion Eradicator shots. On top of that, it's also equipped with a variety of other ordnance, including 4 burst cannons, 4 smart missile systems, and a fragmentation cluster shell launcher if it equips the rail cannon array. While the observed mechanic does give this thing -1 ballistic skill if it targets units that it is not being observed for, which kind of makes you choose between going into infantry sweeping mode or trying to blow vehicles up. By giving +1 to the appropriate weapon systems and -1 to the other ones, it does mean that if it's focused all its weapons on one target, it's going to do a ton of damage. That said, if you want to just turn it into an infantry sweeper, it is good at that. If it does trigger devastating wounds off of its rail cannon arrays, it's going to be able to sweep up to 16 models with a single shot, and it can potentially trigger blast on its ion cannons and just fire an enormous number of burst cannon and smart missile system shots to clear out 1 wounders. This makes it pretty flexible, but it does mostly have to pick a role. If it ends up diverting those anti-infantry weapon systems to shoot at something that it's not being guided against, they're only hitting on 5s. Either way, I think this thing is an absolute boon for the Tau roster. Tau have kind of had a little bit of a strength problem in their faction. Outside of basically the Storm Surge and Hammerhead, hammerheads, most of the army caps out around strength 8, which is not high enough to really deal damage to heavy armor, and especially things like knights. And the Tonar Supremacy suit both comes with enormous strength weapons. Strength 26, I believe, is the highest strength weapon I think we've seen in the entire game thus far, but can also survive that return fire shooting in a way that something like a hammerhead can't. It does cost 685 points, which is a lot, but only comes in at about the cost of 4-ish hammerheads if you're taking 3 and Longstrike, the character version. The benefit of it being concentrated into a single entity means that you only need a single observer to buff all of those ranged attacks. Unlike having multiple hammerheads or a selection of smaller units, you're going to have to observe for each one of those to give them the +1 to hit if you want to. In this case, you only need one sort of support unit to help this guy out and give him +1 to hit, and otherwise he's just doing his thing by himself. Now, whether or not the Tonar ends up stacking up against profiles like hammerheads or Skyray gunships from the regular codex, I'm not 100% sure, but I do think that it is an interesting option to look at. Now let's move on back to the Imperium section of the indexes and look at what is a kind of depressingly similar profile. Although, I can't actually be too mad about this one because it is one of my favorite Imperial Knights from the entire range. This is the Acoustis Knight Porphyrion. These guys are big eggs covered with guns, and the aesthetic is pretty straightforward, and I kind of love it. For the low price of 645 points, so about 60% more than the cost of a Questoris Knight, and about 100 or so points more than most of the Dominus Knight chassis that you'll find, you get a top-line profile that is, in fact, almost identical to the Tonar Supremacy armor. A move 8 T13 2+, save 5+ invulnerable save, specifically against ranged attacks, 30 wound, beast of a unit. This thing is equipped with a very simple set of weapons. It has a top-mounted carapace weapon that can either mount the indirect fire Iron Storm missile pod, firing D6 +6, strength 5, AP0, 1 damage shots, or the Helios defense missiles, which are higher strength and damage at strength 10, AP2, D6 damage, but lack that indirect fire, instead for anti-fly 2+. It also has a couple of autocannons that you can and most likely will replace with las cannons, allowing you to fire up to 5 D6 +1 or D6 damage shots from its defense missiles or its las cannons. However, most of the damage comes from the big weapons on its arm slots. These are the twin Magna las cannons. These are 72-inch range, blast, twin-linked, D6 shot, ballistic skill 3, 18 strength AP4, D6 +6 damage attacks. In addition, if it remains stationary, which will not only buff the hit roll of its carapace mounted weapon up to a 2+, but also grants it the lethal hits ability. So if it does roll a 6 to hit with its enormous Magna las cannon, then it doesn't have to roll the 3+ rerolling to wound literally any profile in the game. The fact that these weapons are twin-linked is actually wild. Strength 18 wounds most vehicles on 2s and basically everything else on 3s, and then you just get a reroll, so you basically are always wounding with this for the most part. So that in and of itself is incredibly strong. This thing is basically impossible to kill at high toughness with a high saving characteristic, and you can hide it in the back of your deployment zone because if it has good lines of sight across the middle of the table, your opponent is unlikely to hide from it thanks to the towering keyword. Thanks to the Imperial and Chaos Knight ally rules, you can put the Porphyrion in any Imperium or Chaos army. So if you are having trouble blowing up tanks, the Porphyrion is here for you. Either of the Knight households proper, however, Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights, can give it that 4+ invulnerable save, and all of them grant a damage ignore roll. Imperial Knights have a 6+ baked in that goes to a 5+ feel no pain if they are honored, and Chaos Knights can give them a 6+ feel no pain with a stratagem, improved to a 5+ if the attacking unit is battle shocked. Chaos Knights can also regenerate them from Ravenous Terror Shades, which is also pretty cool, but it does require enemies within 12 inches to fail battle shock checks, which is most likely not going to take place. However, Imperial Knights are really what sends this thing absolutely through the roof. They can also grant it reroll once to hit and wound from Lay Low the Tyrants, and since it already rerolls its wound rolls, it's not really using that very much, but rerolling its hit rolls is going to be a huge deal because that's the one failure point that it has beyond just rolling garbage on its number of shots. They can also grant it +1 to hit and a bonus to move, toughness, and objective control from Shoulder the Burden if the Porphyrion has taken damage. And it can also get +1 to wound if it really needs it from trophy claim. So altogether, if your opponent makes the mistake of actually trying to shoot this thing and do any damage whatsoever, which they probably won't, you can then hit on 2s, rerolling 1s, wound on 2s, rerolling 1s against enemy monsters and vehicles. And this allows you to kill a Questoris Knight chassis through all of the defensive benefits that they can apply, including rotate ion shields and their 6+ damage ignore in a single shot. Not even including its d6 damage las cannon and Helios missile fire shots. The Magna las cannons themselves will average about 24 damage to a Questoris Knight profile in one go, which is nuts. Trophy claim is actually kind of a free roll for this thing, because especially if it concentrates its fire, it's most likely going to kill whatever it trophy claims on, and then that regenerates the CP that you spend on trophy claim, and you can continue to use it. So it can basically be permanently +1 to wound all the time. It's largely not going to fail to kill whatever monsters or vehicles you're shooting this thing at. Now, being as straightforward as it is, the actual power level of the Porphyrion is a little bit difficult to suss out, because Knights having units that basically one-shot everything within their line of sight is not entirely new to the game. Knights have always had pretty good shooting, and while the profiles in the Knight Index themselves are pretty good at shooting, but not phenomenally spectacular, the Porphyrion is. And the newfound interaction with the towering keyword could potentially prove to be problematic for a unit with such powerful weapons attached to its profile, especially given the amount of resilience that 10th edition has granted units like this, with their ability to benefit from cover and get effects like Armor of Contempt and high base toughness, meaning that even las cannons wounded on 5s, even if it gets the debuff from the towering keyword, not many armies are actually able to threaten it on the first turn. So while I think there is the potential that a unit like this becomes problematic and maybe a little bit too ubiquitous within the metagame, we will just have to see how things rock out. And like I said, it looks kind of cool. I like the Porphyrion. I think it looks pretty sweet. It's definitely like the platonic ideal of a giant gun platform. And, you know, I kind of appreciate the design for its simplicity. So let me know down in the comment section what you think about the Forge World indexes, and if there are any units that you think I missed when discussing the best ones from the selection. Big thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to Magna Baron for sponsoring this video, and big thanks to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.